Hi, everyone. So thanks again for joining today. For those of you who have joined us in the past, welcome back. And for those of you who are new, welcome. I'm Alicia McLeod. I'm a program coordinator with Western Entrepreneurship. For those of you who are not familiar with Western Entrepreneurship, we provide advice, guidance, and resources for those in our community with the intent and purpose of helping them become successful entrepreneurs. In addition to our services, we do have a business advisor who holds dedicated one-to-one sessions with Western students and alumni to help answer any entrepreneurial questions that you might have and give general business advice. So to book one of those meetings, feel free to visit our website at propel.uwo.ca to schedule a coaching session. But let's get started. So if you've been tuning in these last several weeks, you'll know that we've been offering a series of webinars with the goal of providing our community with business education and information in a virtual format. So today, we have the immense pleasure of welcoming Andreas Savaliotis, industry veteran and prominent Canadian social entrepreneur, sharing his unfiltered and raw story behind the story of a failed social venture. Andreas is a past founder of Carrot Rewards, Canada's celebrated health app, and Green Rewards, the world's first consumer eco-loyalty platform. He is a best-selling author, prolific speaker, and recognized thought leader on global impact issues such as public health, climate change, inclusion, and diversity. He serves on the boards of Institute for Canadian Citizenship, Windmill Microlending, and Young Presidents Organization. He advises global health platform providers, NGOs, and academic institutions. He is also a part of our new venture program as an entrepreneur in residence for HBA and MBA students, working with us that way. While we do only have a short time with Andreas, we would love for you to engage with us. So if you have any questions at all throughout our chat, feel free to pop it down in the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Thanks for that good intro. And hello, everybody. It was actually 13 years ago this week that I had a very simple idea. And the idea was that the things that Canadians are so addicted to every day in our consumer life, it's a very Canadian addiction, and it's called points. We all love collecting points in our lives when we shop, when we fly, when we use our credit cards. Those amazing little incentives that we're so hooked on could also be useful as incentives to get us to behave more responsibly. I had grown up in the incentives industry, and I knew how incredibly effective incentives were in changing the behavior of every consumer in this country. But I also had a lot of passion for some important stuff in our society. At the time, climate change had become a big topic, and I kept thinking that there's got to be a way to somehow influence the behavior of millions of people across our country or billions across the world, a simpler way than just running stupid television ads and telling people to somehow drive less or do something good for the environment. And so I came up with the idea of using points as micro incentives to change behavior towards something more positive. And that was the genesis of my first social venture, which was called Green Rewards, which you heard referenced in the introduction. But my first social venture actually essentially led to the creation of my second one, which more of you would know about. It was a venture called Carrot Rewards. And Carrot Rewards was an even bigger idea around using micro incentives to change the behavior of the general public. Here's how Carrot worked. It was an app. It was a very popular app, actually, an app that would talk to you every single day of your life, and it would give you all kinds of little nudges in terms of how to behave. It would say, it would give you a little quiz about how you should be cooking for your family at home, or how much you should be walking every day, or how often you should be going to the gym, or how you should breastfeed if you're a mom, and on and on and on. It was all kinds of sort of general wellness information that it would give you. But instead of just simply talking to you and hoping that you might actually engage, it would reward you for engaging. It would give you a few of your favorite everyday shopping points for engaging. Now, the interesting thing about Carrot, which nobody else had tried to do in the world, is that Carrot would actually give you your choice of rewards. So if you happen to be a wealthy frequent flyer and you loved your frequent flyer miles, you'd be able to choose frequent flyer miles as your rewards on this app. If you happen to be a young urbanite who went to the movies a lot, you would be able to actually earn scene points. If you happen to be somebody living in in a rural area in Canada and drove a lot, drove your truck a lot, and spent a lot of money on gas, and you were hooked on gas points, you would be able to actually earn petrol points, and so on and so on. We essentially had a reward for every single participant, for every single Canadian. And that made Carrot a really, really appealing app for everyone. Here's why Carrot was created. Up until we showed up with this idea, governments in our country, governments, as you know, in our country, pay the health bill when we get sick. And so governments have a motivation to get us to not get sick as much, to live a little bit healthier. Never has that been more obvious than now during COVID. And so governments spend significant amounts of money every year trying to convince us to live better. Believe it or not, if you add it all up between municipal, provincial, and federal governments in Canada, we're spending about $1 billion of our taxpayers' money convincing Canadians to live healthier. But we spend it in very, very old-fashioned ways. Most of it is spent, believe it or not, on TV ads or newspaper ads. So we blast out at TV and we say, hey, Andreas, don't smoke. And we hope that that ad will make a difference. Meanwhile, I'm not a smoker. So even though we're blasting that TV ad towards me and we're spending money for it, it's really not aimed at me. And we're wasting that money. Not to mention the fact that we have no idea who I am. There's no trailing data. There's nothing that tells the government agency that paid for that ad whether I saw that TV ad, whether I did anything about it. It's just this very sort of blunt instrument of pushing out ads and hoping that they'll have an impact on public behavior. We, with Carrot, came up with the exact opposite, which was super targeted, super personalized. It would be my app on my phone that would speak to me, that would know from the way I responded to a previous quiz that I'm not a smoker and therefore wouldn't waste any money or any incentives on me. But it would actually speak to a smoker differently and give them all kinds of little nudges towards finding a way to quit. I don't want to spend too much time telling you how well the app worked, because the purpose of this exercise is to talk to you about why the business ultimately failed and to walk through those lessons. But let me say this. The app proved so spectacularly successful because it was relevant to everybody and because the idea was so new and cool. We had over 1 million Canadians using this app, even though we were only really allowed to roll it out to 3 provinces. We had people changing their behavior so dramatically. At some point, we launched a new layer of rewards on the app that you would earn as long as you met your daily physical activity requirements. And your daily physical activity goals were completely personalized. One day, you could be only walking 5,000 steps on average per day. We would start rewarding you just from meeting that level. And then as time would go on, we would slowly nudge you up and make you more and more physically active. If you can believe it, out of those 1.1 million people that we had on the app, half of them were originally sedentary. They would walk less than 5,000 steps a day. But by the time we were done with them, we had moved them up by 21%. We had made those over 500,000 people more than 20% more physically active every single day, just because we dangled in front of them the tiniest little daily rewards. People would earn an extra couple of seed points every day just for achieving their daily step goal. So this thing had become a great success story in terms of public impact, a great success story in terms of saving money for the government, a great success story in terms of amazing engagement, and most importantly, people would not leave this app. Once they downloaded it and started using it, they were completely hooked on it. It had been celebrated as Canada's App of the Year a couple of years ago. It had become the envy of other governments across the world. Canada's government was winning awards internationally for innovation for this thing. So generally speaking, it was just stardom. This thing was just being celebrated everywhere. And yet, believe it or not, a few months before COVID hit, Carrot was gone. And the tragedy about Carrot being gone just before COVID is, when you think about it, an app that is that engaging, an app that is so effective at getting us to listen to it, and also at getting us to give it information about our daily behavior, would have been the ultimate shield that our country could have asked for at the time of this pandemic. We could have had this app helping us with contact tracing. We could have had it helping us with symptom mapping across the country. We could have had it helping us with influencing behavior. Instead of running television ads and telling Canadians how to behave every night around COVID, we could have been talking to every single Canadian in their own personalized way, depending on who they are, where they live, how high risk they may be, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, we can't do that because Carrot is gone. Now let's get into the ugly stuff. Why is Carrot gone? In a moment, I'm going to walk you through 5 very basic lessons, but you'll quickly realize that the common thread between those 5 lessons is the fact that I started this business as a relatively older tech and social entrepreneur. Most people who start these fun tech startups in our country or in every country tend to be young people with lots of great dreams and lots of great energy, and they tend to be fantastically disruptive and creative. I happen to not have most of those things, but what I had instead was experience. And I had this fascination with doing it right. There were a bunch of things that I thought in my slightly more old-fashioned way I would do better than most. And I used to actually teach younger entrepreneurs, including the kids that I teach at Ivy, how to do those things better. I used to be a firm believer in some of the things I used to teach. And what you're about to discover through the 5 lessons I'll walk you through in a moment is that remarkably, the collapse of Carrot may have proven me wrong. It may have proven that my 5 old-fashioned ways of doing things, which on the surface seem to make so much sense, may have actually contributed to the demise of our beautiful social venture. So let's get started. Let's pick up the first lesson, which has to do with early revenue. And let me scandalize you with this a little bit. I was the old guy who would walk around Canada's tech startup community and meet too many young entrepreneurs who knew nothing about revenue. They knew plenty about investors. They knew exactly how to charm investors with their beautiful idea. They knew how to talk about big dreams and big reach and big numbers and all those things, but none of those numbers had anything to do with reality in terms of dollars. They didn't know how to go out there and generate real revenues from real clients. And to be honest, over time, that became the norm. Over time, investors started to throw money at all kinds of tech startups, regardless of the founder's ability to generate real revenues. They were more focused on the uniqueness of the dream and the idea, and much less focused on the money that was coming in the door. I wanted to do it the right way. And frankly, I had a unique opportunity to do it the right way because I had some pretty significant clients, mostly government clients, who wanted to play with Carrot in a very serious way. So I had the luxury of being able to start Carrot with 7.5 million of committed revenues already from 2 levels of government. One was from the federal government and the other was from the government of BC. Both wanted to be significant clients of this platform because they both saw that this thing made a lot of sense. And so I actually thought, this is great. This also gets to prove my point that if you approach investors with a beautiful business plan that shows how you know how to make money and how you'll be making money from day one. And in fact, within a year and a bit from launching the business, believe it or not, we had our first month when we broke even. I thought, if you go at it the old-fashioned way, you'll look even better. Not only do we have a big idea, not only are we going to have an amazing, amazing app with an incredible number of users out there, but we will also be making money right from the very beginning. Well, guess what? Wrong. I thought I was right, but it wasn't right. Because one of the things that happens when you show up in front of investors and you say, look at me, I've got revenues already. Look, I had $3 million in revenues in my first year. And I had $7 million in revenues in my second year, which are real numbers, by the way. That's what was happening with Carrot. Believe it or not, when you do that, you actually have the opposite effect on your prospective investors. Because what you're doing by saying I have 3 million this year is you're offering them a yardstick. You're saying, now you have something to really measure my potential performance by, right? I'm starting from 3. Well, guess what a lot of these dreamy investors do? Is they say, okay, if you're starting from 3 and if you're going to be another unicorn like the ones I like to chase, that means that next year you should be at 300, right? Next year you should be growing not from 3 to 7, but from 3 to 100 times that, to 300 million. And clearly, once they started following us through our life and once they started looking through our trajectory, which I thought was a great trajectory, we more than doubled our revenues from our first year to our second year. But once you do that in that kind of setting in front of investors, they say, oh my God, this is not a unicorn. This is just another old-fashioned business that's going to grow slowly. I have a lot more to say about this, and you'll read more about it in a book I've got coming out soon. But in essence, that was the core of the first lesson, is that those of us who advocate for having early revenues and attracting investors based on the early revenues might be in for a bit of a surprise. Second counterintuitive lesson was the one about having big, stable, and in my case, government clients. Like I said to you before, a lot of these young startup entrepreneurs don't even know how to distinguish between a large and a small customer. They can sometimes come out and brag about the fact that at least they've got some customers or about how many customers they have, but it's less about the numbers, less about the dollar numbers. I happen to be the old-fashioned guy who was saying, no, you need to have large customers with long contracts, the customers that give you the confidence to be able to build on your revenues and to build on your early success. Well, what could be more stable, more reliable, more high profile than a government customer, than the government of Canada and the government of British Columbia, and then after that, the government of Newfoundland? Wrong again. And wrong for three reasons, not just one, three. The first reason is governments are slow. Governments by design or by default move very slowly. And that can be really traumatizing for a tech startup that constantly needs fuel, that constantly needs cash. If you have decided that you're going to delay bringing on a lot of investor cash because you can get revenue from your clients, and if a government client has said that they're going to sign up with you in the next 60 days, you can't actually take that to the bank, because 60 days could easily become 6 months, and 6 months could easily become 16 months. So we had all kinds of surprises in dealing with government because we thought we were done, and then we would wait and wait and wait, and it would take forever. And that is pretty well endemic, with some rare exceptions, which I'll mention in a second. The second issue with government is that their decision-making tends to be pretty erratic. There's elections, which can change things. One of the things that contributed to the end of Carrot was that our largest government client, by the time Carrot had grown up a little bit, was the government of Ontario. The Liberal government of Ontario that was about to collapse 2 years ago when the Doug Ford government came into power. Well, as the Liberal government of Ontario became completely distracted by their imminent collapse, they actually started to ignore a bunch of projects, including Carrot. And so our funding disappeared. Our commitment for them to be a client disappeared. And that created a gigantic hole inside Carrot, one that we couldn't fill with anything else. But it wasn't just Ontario. It was in a bunch of places where you would see really erratic behavior, where you would hear a yes one day and hear a no the next day. That's not unusual with governments because there is so many different conflicting priorities. And that's actually a bit of a segue to my third lesson around governments, which is governments tend to be much less ROI oriented than most people think. It might make sense to you and me that if you show up and you say to a government agency that I can save you 96 cents of the dollar because for every dollar you used to spend on TV advertising, I can get you the exact same results in terms of impact, in terms of public behavior change for 4 cents worth of incentives. And by the way, those numbers are real. That's literally how much more dramatically cheaper it was to use incentives and use an app like Carrot instead of running TV ads. So if you walk into a government agency and you say that, you would think that a very basic sort of ROI proposition would actually work because it would work for any private sector client. But you'd be shocked at how difficult that is as a proposition for governments. You don't want to walk into a government agency and say, I found a way for you to spend a fraction of your budget. They actually don't like that. You don't want to walk into a government agency and say, I have a complete revolution to the way you used to do things. That may not make you look so good about the way you were doing things before. We actually, in my tenure over the last 13 years as a social entrepreneur, I've had more than a few examples of government agencies not wanting me to promote the fact that they made a 90-degree turn by dealing with us because it makes them look bad about the way they were doing things before. So it actually can be very difficult to propose completely new or completely smart things to government. It doesn't always work. I want to highlight one exception because I don't want this to come across as a generalization. There were people out there in government who had the vision and had the ability to understand and the ability to fall in love, frankly, with change and with opportunity to do things differently. In fact, I'll raise two examples. One was the fellow in the federal government who essentially co-invented Carrot with me. It was a man in the at Health Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada, who created so many waves and overcame so many bureaucratic obstacles because from day one, he could see this amazing revolution potentially making a big difference. Second guy I want to celebrate is the former Minister of Health of Newfoundland. As you know, Newfoundland is a small-ish province. So when I showed up in Newfoundland, I was immediately introduced to the minister himself, who was also the deputy premier at the time. And I can tell you that within maybe 45 seconds of our conversation, he had gotten it. And within 10 minutes of being in his office, he turned to his staff and he said, "We are doing this, and we're doing this right away." So there are people in government who behave truly like business executives, who see ROI and are decisive and can erase all three of these problems I just outlined. But generally speaking, dealing with governments, dealing with very large clients, proved to be exactly the opposite of the lesson I was trying to teach young entrepreneurs. Lesson number 3. By the way, I'm moving quickly through these because I know these lessons are so scandalizing and so counterintuitive for some that they create a lot of questions. So I want to leave most of our time together for Q&A. So let me move through the remaining 3 lessons and then I'll stop blabbering on and I'll let you guys ask me all kinds of questions. Question number 3 for a business like mine is about impact investment. As you know, we are living in the era of impact investment. Everybody wants to talk about impact these days. Every VC firm out there has created a little bit of an impact brand around themselves. Every bank talks about investing only on impact. It is definitely the era of impact. So in some respects, I felt like the world had caught up to me because I was always the impact guy. And so we decided early on that Carrot would only be pitched as a social venture to investors, not just as a venture. It was a venture. It was a tech venture that could make money. And it was actually, as you heard earlier on, could become profitable fairly quickly. It had a very simple way of making money. And in case you're wondering how we made money, we had the simplest formula in the world. The points that Canadians earned through our platform were points that we went out and bought from the various points programs, from Aeroplan, from Seed, from Petro, and so on. We would buy those points, mark them up, and sell them to our government clients. So every time a citizen out there earned 5 scene points for doing something, they would actually, those 5 scene points would contain some margin for us. It was extremely simple and straightforward. There was nothing complicated about it. And to be honest, it was very ethically straightforward as well, in the sense that we didn't make any money unless people earned those points, which means that we had generated some impact in their behavior. So it was only if we did good that we made money. So because of that, we thought it was the easiest thing for us to do, to actually grab our story and go and pitch it to impact investors. Well, guess what we learned? And it was a pretty harsh lesson, frankly. If you went to the true sort of niche impact investment firms, the ones that only invested in hardcore social ventures, that space was so nascent and it was made up of such incredibly small, almost I would call them tree-huggy type of investment firms, that they couldn't make sense of us because we were so commercial sounding. We were talking about millions of users and we were talking about generating straight, good, solid profits out of every single point that we sold. We were a real for-profit social venture. And so the impact investment firms at the extreme sort of impact end of the spectrum were not used to seeing opportunities like us, and they didn't know what to do with us. At the other end of the spectrum, at a real kind of hardcore Bay Street VC community, everybody was putting the word impact on their forehead. But when you arrived at their offices and you pitched Carrot as an impact venture, the moment you went there, they actually immediately discounted your ability to make money. So they were using impact as a little bit of a story, as a little bit of a veneer, but in reality, they would prefer to see you not talk about impact and talk about how much money you're going to make. So it felt like we were so stuck in the middle that neither type of investor was really drawn to our hybrid story. So that was a huge, painful lesson for us as well. Let's move on to lesson number 4. Lesson number 4 had to do with culture. I again, being in my 50s by the time I started this and having lived in the world of incentives for a very long time, one of the things that I had become completely enamored with was the idea of using incentives and using whatever you could inside an organization to build a real cohesive culture. I was also growing a little bit allergic to the mad scramble of the tech startup world where gig workers and employees, as we call them, had become essentially commodities, right? Where people were being used for what they had, but they didn't really have to belong. I was the old-fashioned guy who wanted to build a business and an organization where it was everybody's home. I wanted to build a real village culture. And I think we pushed the pendulum to an absolute extreme at Carrot. We created a culture that became the envy of Toronto's tech community. People were saying, God, if you go work at Carrot, that's the place you'll never leave because it's a bit of a magnet. And we truly had no turnover. Everybody came to Carrot, loved belonging, loved kind of fusing their life with their colleagues' lives. And we created this incredibly cohesive, beautiful place where everybody belonged. And of course, that made a real difference in how productively people worked and how enthusiastic everybody was about their work. It felt like it was our company. 43 people worked in that company, and it was as if you had 43 owners. Except we missed something. We missed something really important. When you create this much cohesion, when you create this much of a village, when everybody belongs to everybody else in the company, when my job does not end where yours begins, but my job overlaps completely with yours because we're all kind of rolling up our sleeves and we're all doing it together. You're creating something that I now have learned to call performance fog. It actually becomes very difficult to manage performance because there is no crispness anymore. There's no accountability of the more traditional kind. You have everybody essentially gelling around any of the deficits so that you can never see, as a manager or as a CEO, you can never see what's broken inside the company because whatever might be broken will quickly be filled in by somebody else. Or in most cases that'll happen, but there are cases where whatever might be broken may not be fixable. We had a situation once where I was faced with a very severe complaint by a client about a real problem we had inside the organization, about somebody who had created difficulties with that client and kind of mismanaged expectations and all that. And there were multiple layers of issues for me because the first thing was I didn't see it coming. Again, our very villagey kind of culture made it very difficult for me to spot the problem before it became a real problem for the client. But even worse, when we got the client complaint, and given the severity of the client complaint, when we had no choice but to remove that person from the company, believe it or not, taking a person out of that kind of culture was almost as if you removed a Jenga piece from a Jenga tower. You know, when the culture is that cohesive, it almost has no tolerance for you removing a piece of it. So once we took that individual out of the company, the culture just crumbled. So performance fog is something that we should look for very carefully and frankly carries all kinds of risk. Lesson number 5, and the final one, and this is a very personal one. Again, as an old-fashioned dude, I decided that this is my baby, my company, my village, but it's also a village that's very welcoming to all of my friends. Having lived as long as I had lived in the industry, I had all kinds of friends, some of whom wanted to be investors, some of whom wanted to be throwing their kids at the company to go and work for us. It attracted a lot of friend enthusiasm. Everybody felt like they invested something in Carrot. A lot of it was very genuine enthusiasm. A lot of it was really good for the company. We ended up with some beautiful young people that were thrown at me by friends and their families. We ended up with unexpected investors who frankly made me feel a little bit uncomfortable because you're now accepting your friend's money as investment in your business. But I was open to it. I kept thinking, this is the village. This is this beautiful community where everybody belongs. Until, of course, the business collapsed. And when the business collapsed, it was incredible how many of those friends turned out not to be real friends. How many of them disappeared just because their kid may have lost his or her job. And I'm not exaggerating. Literally, there were friends of mine whose children worked at my company who vanished out of my life when the jobs that the kids had vanished. even though the kids knew they were working in a crazy startup, even though the parents should have known that this was obviously a typically startup risky move, still, the friendships, as it turns out, were worth less than the jobs. I'm going to stop there. Again, what I've just given you is a little bit of a teaser of a book that will be coming out very soon in the coming weeks. That's called Carrot Juice, very appropriately, which will dive into these 5 lessons in a little more detail and with even more candor. But I think I had promised our host that I would literally split our time today in half. We are at exactly the halfway point of this webinar right now. So I will now shut up and I'll turn it over to you guys to ask me questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andreas. So we have a couple that have come in. So we can start with the first one that we received was, in your opinion, was Carrot Rewards early for its time?
Interesting. I have to admit it's not the first time I'm being asked this question, and I would argue that it probably was. I would argue that if Carrot had not been tried until now, and today we were pitching the government of Canada to become a founding client of a platform like this, given all the lessons we've learned from COVID, I think we would actually do even better than we did 5 years ago. So in that sense, for sure, it was early. The idea of using incentives to influence behavior, public behavior, was definitely not early, and we had tried it in a previous venture. We knew it worked very well, but the idea of kind of creating a once in a country's lifetime platform that harnesses some of the most popular points programs into a single platform, into a single app. And I'm saying once in a country's lifetime because frankly and sadly, Carrot cannot be replicated. You can't go back and do it a second time. You can't go back through the same points providers again and stitch all this together again. It was a one-try thing. So from that perspective, I suppose it was early. Hindsight is 2020. Had we known that the country would be faced with an existential crisis around a pandemic, maybe we would have waited. It's just a shame that it's not around today because it could have really made a difference. Thank you, Alicia.
For sure. Kind of around that question, we have another one that says, Andreas, thank you very much for speaking with us today. I was a daily Carrot user. I purchased a premium membership for about $50 and earned about $500 worth of Scene points in just a few months. It was an incredible ROI. It was such a lucrative way to earn Scene points. I kept thinking that whomever was providing the service must be hemorrhaging money because users like myself were milking the system. How correct was my intuition? Were you too generous in user payouts?
Wow. So this is a bit of a complicated answer, and I'm very impressed. Whoever asked you that question must have been a real keener and must have done extremely well in terms of their health. So thank you, whoever you were, and also thank you for the question. But so the answer comes in 2 parts. Were we too generous in offering daily rewards to Canadians, not for the premium product, but for the basic free Carrot product? I would say no, we weren't. We had measured it very carefully. To be honest with you, we were measuring it carefully because we had government clients who wanted to spend as little money as possible. I will confess to all of you now that Carrot is no longer alive, that we were able to run Carrot to influence all those people every single day for an average of less than 1.5 cents per day. That's an extremely small investment on the part of all of our government agencies to be motivating me and millions like me to be living a little bit healthier. 1.5 pennies a day was making all that difference. So I don't think those were generous payouts at that level. Now, the premium product, which was entirely my dumb idea, we created it because we knew that people would be willing to pay more money for an opportunity to earn an accelerated rate of return on points. We never imagined, however, that Canadians are so points hungry that the ones that would choose to pay for premium would be the ones that would self-select for that audience would be such extreme keeners, like the keener who just asked the question. But all of our modeling turned out to have been so completely wrong in terms of who would actually want that product. So your listener is definitely correct in that we were hemorrhaging money for him or her, And frankly, there were several thousand like him or her who signed up very quickly, for each of whom were hemorrhaging money. That's not what put us under, right? That was a very small bill in relative terms. But it was interesting to see that Canadians are so extremely keen on incentives that they were willing to pay money, and then they would become the biggest keeners in completing quizzes and achieving daily step goals and all the things that Garrett did. So that's a fascinating question and a great lesson.
Perfect. Thank you. Our next question, we have a couple around investors. So if you could time travel back, go back, redo the launch of Carrot Rewards, what investors would you pursue? Would you still look towards government, again, federal or provincial, or would you go to private investors or VCs, different investment streams? And how would you position your financials to these investors?
So again, for clarity, government were not investors. Government agencies were clients from the get-go. And that's how we structured it from the very beginning, so that they would truly be a for-profit business that could sustain itself. All of our investors were private sector investors. A lot of them were actually private individuals at the very beginning. We had 2 small VCs. But then, like I said, as the company grew and as we started looking for more substantial venture capital to go into the business, that's when we ran into the whole kind of impact question mark. So again, hindsight is 2020, but I think what we would have done differently in the climate that we were living in for the last 3 or 4 years is we would have actually decreased the investor focus on impact, which, by the way, saddens me, right? We should all be focused on impact, and every VC out there should be focused on the degree to which the money they're investing is doing something good for the world. But like I said to you, the trouble is that impact is such a new concept out there that the moment you would bring it up in an investor meeting, they would instantly discount your ability to make money. They would think, oh, this guy is all about impact, and he doesn't really know how to generate returns. So I think if we ever had to replay this movie, we would definitely pitch this more as a straight for-profit venture with very clear profit metrics, perhaps even more aggressive profit objectives than what we had set for ourselves, maybe even with a tweaked business model. But we would still keep it extremely straightforward, extremely easy to spot the impact and to see how impact drives returns. We just wouldn't talk as much about impact.
Great, thank you. The next question is around, you mentioned culture in a village and how this was your baby. And so I just wanted to talk to you a bit more about what your thoughts are from going through those steps and those lessons on building your team. And so it's kind of this catch-22 where you want the people who work for you to be super passionate about the job, but also understand that it's your baby in the end. So what advice would you give any startups or entrepreneurs in creating their team to look for?
It's a great question, and the only thing I would change about your question, Alicia, is I would say that the issue isn't with employees understanding that it's still my baby. I definitely loved the fact that everybody felt like it was their baby as well. The issue was that people still had to understand that it was still a business and it was still a job, and I think that's the bit that we probably fogged up a little bit over time. We created some fog around it, right? And I call it performance fog, right? So a better sense of balance would be probably the answer I would give you. We would figure out a way from the very beginning of creating an incredible opportunity for people to feel like they belong and like they own it and like they never want to leave it. But at the same time, we would structure expectations. We would structure the intake process. We made it so much our club, our village, that, to be honest with you, when it came to intake of new people, the feel and the belongingness would be a much more important criterion than the real hardcore experience. So that alone tells you that once we brought them in, we would still be focused much more on making sure they belong, making sure that they are hanging out with us, that this feels like it's their village, as opposed to knowing for sure that they know how to do the job. There's this old-fashioned, again, so many old-fashioned lines come out of me, but there's this old-fashioned adage about the fact that you should always be hiring somebody better than yourself. You should always be hiring somebody that could actually end up doing your job better than you. And I'm not sure that we were doing that. We were always hiring amazing people, amazing souls, amazing friends, people who did amazing things inside the company, but we were not necessarily looking for the best of the technical talent and the best of the technocrat talent in every single field first. That wasn't our first priority. Our first priority was don't change my village. This is a beautiful village. We should all belong here. And that created the performance fog I referenced earlier.
Would you be weary of exploring, like you had mentioned, friends, sons and daughters that were working for you, and getting kind of too involved in terms of the investors being friends? Are you weary of that now, or would you just go someone extremely outside of your circle?
Funny you should ask this, because a very wise man in my life, after Carrot went down last year, and after I was heartbroken about a bunch of friends who disappeared out of my life, said to me, "This is probably the best thing to happen to you, because it was a clarifying event. Now you know who your real friends are," right? So in a bizarre kind of way, I would answer to you and I would say, no, actually, that's something that probably I wouldn't change, right? If friends are fickle enough to only see you as an investment or as an employer for their kid, and then they go away after that, well, that's probably a good thing, right? They were not really your friend, and it's okay to not have them as a friend after that. So I wouldn't be as weary. I would at the same time, though, just to connect this with your previous question, I would say that maybe I wouldn't be quite as enthusiastic about grabbing the first friend's kid that is presented to me to come and work for us for the summer or for a permanent job, just because it's my friend's kid, and because of that, this person will be so enthusiastic, right? I wouldn't rank enthusiasm or belongingness at the top of my criteria list. I would maybe put it on the second or third spot in criteria list. But first I would say, okay, is this the best summer student we can get? Or is this the best we can get, right? Pushing that too high up because they were a friend and because my heart felt so attached to them was a mistake.
Great, thank you. We have another one that says, having seen how technology has played a role in South Korea's battle against COVID, is there any possibility that some form of Carrot could be resurrected?
I suppose one should never say never. But let me also be blunt with your listeners about one very simple truth behind this. The only way Carrot could ever be resurrected would be in partnership with our federal government for the sake of the whole country. So there's a lot of detail I left out of the second chapter, the second lesson that we discussed earlier, which is about having large government clients as your clients for this. One of the biggest challenges we faced in that area was that Canada is actually not one country, it's 14 countries. It's the federal government and the 13 governments of our provinces and territories. And so, believe it or not, this naive founder who essentially co-founded Carrot with the federal government, because our founding client was the federal government, assumed that because the feds were the founding client, every province would play along, right? The feds were essentially providing this gorgeous platform to the provinces to go and use it for the promotion of anything from physical activity to healthy eating to smoking cessation and so on. And every one of those priorities are critical for every one of our 13 provinces and territories. Well, guess what happened on the road to that? Every province allowed politics or agendas or attitudes to creep into the conversation. So we would show up in Edmonton, for instance, and the government of Alberta would say, this is made in Ottawa. We don't want this. We would show up in Quebec City and we would hear the same thing, or in Winnipeg. So we quickly realized that we then had to do all the hard selling from province to province in order for this to really take hold. And 3.5 years after the launch of Carrot, we only had 3 provinces with Carrot users. So in the era of COVID, for something big like this to work, we would have to behave like a much more centralized country, like South Korea, right? South Korea implemented technology for all of South Korea. So our federal government could potentially implement a platform like this for the whole country. And by the way, that's already not happening. If you watch the news every night, you'll hear every night something that saddens me, which is that the province of Alberta is now sort of launching a contact tracing app. And the province of New Brunswick is thinking of doing a similar thing, but obviously a different app. So before you know it, our tiny country of 38 million people will end up having 14 different approaches to contact tracing. Carrot, as a single platform, could have done that, but it would have had to be a national platform. And as I said to our friends in Ottawa recently, if somebody took Carrot with its 1.1 million users in 3 provinces and said, we're cranking it up, we're turning it on for every Canadian, and we have the funds, which, as you heard, are not very many funds, right? All it takes is 1.5 pennies per day. We're taking those funds and allocating them to taking Carrot across the land. I swear to you, Alicia, we could have gone from 1.1 million users to all 30 million adult users in this country, all 30 million adults as users of this app in this country in a span of weeks. We could have easily done that. But again, what was missing and what's still missing today is the ability for the country to do this as one.
Thank you for that. And you kind of alluded to this when you were chatting there. But did you ever think of exporting the concept to another country where you might have had different partnerships and relationships to recreate the model?
We sure did. So there's a country out there that's much more centralized than Canada, with a very similar approach to healthcare and health promotion. And it's a country that we're all very familiar with. It's called the United Kingdom. And so we had been in discussions for the last year in Carrot's life with Public Health England to create a much faster version of Carrot in that country, a much faster ramp up. And very, very close to the end of Carrot's life, we actually got a contract with Public Health England to begin doing this. And those of you who may be following me on Twitter would have seen me a year and a half ago celebrating that, because that was such a breakthrough for us. And frankly, because we were running into so much trouble in Canada with the fragmentation of our approaches in this country, I started seeing that as a bit of a life insurance policy for Carrot. I thought, this is great. If we get a large enough client in Public Health England, at least that will help the business survive. Unfortunately, that came so close to the end that we did not have enough time to implement this program, and it fell apart. But yeah, that was definitely in the works. We had also began early stage discussions with the government of Germany and with the government of the United Arab Emirates. And I'm sure there would have been other countries, because this thing was being celebrated everywhere. There was an event, actually, a global innovation event for government, where Carrot won the top prize out of hundreds of entries from around the world. And so every government had its eyes on us in some form, and it would have been fun.
Thank you for that. We've had a couple people ask, what's next for you, apart from the would you dive into point incentive-based venture space again, or?
Who knows is the real answer, and that's a very honest answer. I saw that in your opening slide, you defined me as being a social entrepreneur in full rewirement, as I call it, and it's true. I'm still in full rewirement, and rewirement sometimes turns into retirement for some of us. I'm spending all of my time right now on nonprofit boards and enjoying that. I'm also, as is obvious, very focused on the book and on telling this story. I think this story will have some impact on the lives of others who are thinking of starting things. But who knows? Who knows? It's fun to not have a plan yet.
One here that says, did you ever think of Carrot Rewards as a data company?
Absolutely. I love that question. And by the way, most of the time that question comes at me from a negative perspective. You know, people used to be a little bit terrified about the fact that we had, over 1 million lives in our hands, and we were collecting, if you can believe this, over 2 billion data points on those people. 2 trillion data points, because we had about 2 million data points per user, right? So you multiply that times 1 million users, that's 2 trillion data points. So we were very much a data company. Now, from a consumer point of view, the good news is we were a data company in Canada, founded in Canada, governed by Canada's privacy laws, working with the government of Canada. So there were so many layers of safety for the consumer that nobody ever had to worry about us selling their data or manipulating their data in any kind of unethical way. The most manipulation of their data we would ever do would be to figure out who Alicia is. And because Alicia happens to live in a certain area that has some sort of a pronounced issue, like for instance, you may be living in an area that has high obesity, we could be targeting you with more obesity related messages. Or if you had told us along the way that you are a smoker, we could certainly start targeting you with more smoker specific information, but that's about all the data manipulation we were doing. The reason it's important, though, to talk about data is because as the mission of Carrot kept growing, the breadth of data that we gathered made us more and more sophisticated at being able to influence you. We knew who you were, we knew what your triggers were, we knew how much you earned even. Along the way, you would start revealing to us things about your lifestyle that would suggest your level of earnings, your tendency to live a certain way versus another way. It would become so amazingly easy for us to target you with the most effective incentives that would influence your behavior. And the reason I'm so passionate about this, as you can see, is because that is exactly the opposite of our poor country running television ads right now or newspaper ads and saying, Alicia, stay 6 feet apart from somebody else during COVID, right? Because you just don't know who sees those messages. You don't know what they do with them, and you can never follow up with them. We had the most incredible follow-up ability, and we could follow up. We could go back and measure and see how people's lives had changed as a result of what they heard from us.
So interesting. Thank you for that. We have one here. It says, what approaches did you take to market Carrot to your end users? Is there any advice?
That's a great question. Well, so I'm going to shock your listeners by admitting that our marketing budget at Carrot was virtually zero. And let me explain why. We were the lucky company, we were the lucky platform that relied on its suppliers to market us to a huge number of Canadians for free. The amazing thing about Carrot is, as you heard at the beginning, it offered you your favorite everyday points, scene points, airplane miles, petrol points, RBC rewards, and so on. Well, all of those points come from very large companies that have very, very large audiences, very large user bases. And those companies, each of those companies stood to make money as we became more successful. They love selling their points. So the more successful we became, the more users we got on Carrot, the better they would do because we would be buying more points from them. So guess what that meant? That as soon as we launched, and as soon as we asked one of those suppliers to go and let the way to earn a whole bunch of extra scene points, these suppliers of ours would be more than happy to blast out a huge email campaign to their members to tell them that there is a new way to earn extra scene points or extra airplane miles. And because Canadians are so addicted to their points, the moment an email like this would land in our inbox, we would all go, oh my God, why wouldn't I download this app? Of course, it's a free app. It makes me live better and healthier, and it gives me extra points. So we never had to go and market the app to anybody because it was essentially self-marketed. And the other thing we created, which was very, very Uber-ish, is we gave our users incentives to tell their friends about Carrot. So once you had the Carrot app on your phone, if you referred somebody else, not only would the other person get a few extra points for downloading the app, but so would you. So those referral incentives created an amazing thing. About 50% of our growth actually was organic growth that came from referral incentives.
Great, thank you. I'm just being mindful of our time. We do have, I guess, time for one more question before we wrap up. Obviously, your story is a story of resilience, and you've been so great with being so raw and unfiltered with us today. Is there any advice that you would give to entrepreneurs when their venture doesn't necessarily go the way that they planned it, and any advice around getting back on the horse and staying resilient?
So I'm going to quote somebody. There's a very well-known man on Bay Street who's funded a lot of ventures and who, through funding Carrot, became a friend of mine. His name is Sam Dubach. He used to be the chair of BDC, among other things. He's a very well-known man and a wonderful guy. And the day that Carrot went under, I would say probably less than 10 minutes after the news was official, he was the first guy to call me. Remember, he was an investor, right? He was a guy who actually had just lost a bunch of money. And you know what he said to me? His opening line was one word: congratulations. He literally called me to congratulate me for the journey, for the effort, for having achieved something. And it really put a whole bunch of things in perspective. You know, it put my own misery about having lost my dream business into perspective. It put my employees, my dreamy employees' misery. It put the anger about the friends who disappeared into perspective. It just about put everything into perspective, right? Everything is a journey in life, right? It's not, we shouldn't just be always focused on the destination. The real joy that we derive, the real satisfaction that we derive from doing things in this world is from the journey, not from having become something or having arrived somewhere. And so the fact that he called me to congratulate me on the journey, the guy who just lost a whole bunch of money, just meant so much. And I think that's such an important thing for your listeners to keep in mind as well. The vast majority of startups don't make it. And we thought we had beaten the odds. It turns out we hadn't beaten the odds. But you should go into it assuming that the most of the joy you'll get from this, most of the fulfillment you'll get from this, most of the difference you'll make from whatever journey you're embarking on will be during the journey, not when you arrive.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We're just coming up to our time, so I do want to thank you so much again, Andreas. It's been such a pleasure to be chatting with you and for you to share your inspiring story and lessons learned with everyone. I do want to say that we've loved having you once again. Andreas is a good friend of the Business University in our new venture projects here. And just to let everyone know that we do obviously run this webinar series. We try to do it twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 2:30 to 3:30. And we have a lot of great upcoming speakers like Andreas coming up to share their story as well. So be sure to follow us on Eventbrite if you don't already, to see what's coming up next. And be sure to keep an eye out for Andreas's book that is coming out in a couple of weeks here, you said, Andreas. But once again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.